All right, Emily, thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, I came across an article that you wrote.
Uh-huh.
I think it was actually a fitness and wellness space article, maybe about
Yes.
wellness. It was an article about wellness. I'm pretty
About
sure.
fitness fads.
Fitness,
Yes.
yeah. And I was like, oh, this is right up my alley because I've been in the fitness profession forever. And it was a
hmm
very, uh, it had a lot of punch to it.
Has a lot of punch. Yeah. I mean, I write for Vox, obviously, and I cover business and finance. But one thing I also do over at Vox is have a newsletter that's called The Big Squeeze, and basically looks at the ways that kind of we are squeezed and tricked under capitalism. Not to say that fitness fads are a trick, but basically, as a person who feels like I have fallen for a million different fitness fads and has a Peloton sitting in the room next to me, I was like, this is kind of a fun one. And I know actually recently you had a guest on who I spoke to as well, right? Natalia,
Natalia's great. Yeah.
yeah, who covers this a lot. And so basically, like, I talked to my editor and we said, like, why not do a story on like the ways that we kind of continue to spend money on fitness, even though like, probably fine to just like go for a walk or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting because I spend so much time on committees and stuff talking about fitness and wellness and kind of how in our business, it's kind of our fault. We've done a weird job of messaging and providing the
Mm-hmm.
messengers for what it means to be fit and all the different propaganda and items. It's kind of a snake oil salesperson type of business in many ways, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if I would say that, but like I think for this story, at least that I worked on over the summer, like there isn't money in telling people to go for a walk. There isn't money in telling people that their gym membership that costs $25 a month is just fine. And so, you have a fitness industry that obviously you know much more about than I do, but that is constantly inventing a new thing. I think back to when I was younger and my mom got into Tae Bo in the 90s and watching my mom punch and kick in our house in Wisconsin by herself and make me do
Yeah.
it with her. And I talked to a lady over the summer who lived in LA and had been in the workout videos, and she said it was like a cult. And she was telling me like, oh no,
Hmm.
no, but it's not the same as like a Peloton or Soul Cycle. But I think like there's an argument to be made there that it is, and that these things sort of come and go, in part because like marketers and new companies pop up, in part because things get trendy, and in part because you get bored with workouts. Like you want something new. It's fun to try a different thing, and sometimes it's also terrible to try a different thing, but you do it anyway.
Yeah, it's always a different hustle in fitness all the time. I mean, it's been like that forever. And, the industry hasn't been formalized for a really long. It's not been that long that the industry has been formalized. So I feel like we're kind of finding our way, but we always have this thread of like what's new, what's different. And it's hugely unregulated, the industry as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I thought the article was really interesting and your approach to it. But I like all the articles that you write. Like the airport one was very interesting to me because I travel a lot. And
Which one?
you're trapped in the airport, like with the
Oh,
pricing and everything. I mean, like it's kind of a crazy environment, you know?
right. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, that one was just interesting because we are trapped, like everybody experiences this, right? You go to the airport, you are stuck there. And if you are anything like me, I will almost always stop to get a glass of wine before getting on the plane, like
Yeah.
full stop. And I do kind of feel like there are no rules at the airport. Um, but at the same time, like you do pay for the fact that there are no rules at the airport. That being said, there are rules, but um, it's not the airports can charge whatever, at least in the United States. I got into this a little bit that they're allowed to do something called street pricing plus 10 or 15%. Now, the weird thing about quote unquote street pricing is that it's calculated. It's a little bit funky, the calculation. Basically, the airport says to the restaurant, let's say, you can charge whatever street pricing is plus 15% on top of that, for example. But then the airport and the restaurant kind of haggle over what street pricing is. So, like, I live in New York City. Street pricing at JFK is not what it is at the bodega around the corner from me. It is what it is at a restaurant in Midtown that I would not go to. So it is a little bit tricky, but it is, they know that they have a captive audience. And it is also, I think, to be fair to the airport vendors, a lot of the people I talked to did say it is, it's expensive to operate at the airport. There are things that you are doing at the airport to operate there that you wouldn't elsewhere, right? Like you have to get all of your employees through security. They also have to work kind of wonky hours. Getting a food delivery is not, you're not pulling up on the side of the road, right? You might have to drive onto the tarmac. Well, then you have to get insurance in case that truck runs into an airplane. So there are all sorts of expensive reasons, or there are all sorts of reasons that operating at the airport would be a little bit more expensive. I mean, that being said, it is hard not to feel like when you go to the airport, you are getting a little bit squeezed, but that's kind of the price at least somebody like me ends up paying, because the right answer is ultimately like bring a snack and sit at the gate by yourself. But not everybody's that responsible.
I thought that was interesting. I've noticed kind of a thread in your writing is like you'll say things like that, but then you're like, but I'm not going to do that. Like I'm going to do like, and I love that level of honesty that you bring to your writing. Is like you're not trying to say, well, yes, I'm so virtuous, I would do this. You're like, well, I'm not going to do it, but here's probably what would be good, type of thing.
Right. I mean, I think that's like, it's tricky because I think like as consumers, we don't like to think about our roles in things sometimes. Like, to be honest, some of the meanest emails I've ever gotten were over a story I wrote, I think I want to say in 2021, about credit card rewards points. Like, because basically the way credit card rewards work is like when you go to, I don't know, a store, right? If you use a credit card reward, like a rewards credit card, sorry, I've been talking all day. So if you use a rewards credit card, the merchant has to pay a higher fee on that than they would if you use cash or a debit card, a transaction fee. And they pass that fee a lot of the time onto other consumers, right? So or the merchant does. So if they're they have to spend a bunch of money on these credit card transaction fees, they eventually just pass it into their product. So it is a little bit of a cash transfer situation where cash payers, who often tend to be lower income, wind up subsidizing the rewards of people who have the credit card rewards, who oftentimes are wealthier, a bit more credit savvy. A lot of people didn't like that. We don't like to think about our own behavior. And like, I don't like to think about it either. Like I use a rewards credit card, like full stop. I think that the answer there is like, if you want to, maybe don't use it at like the bodega on the corner. There's a reason that the bodega guy's like, hey, we'll give you a cash discount, or, and the flip side, like we're going to charge 10% more if you are using a rewards credit card, especially if you're making like a $5 purchase. But I do think like there is something to like, it's really uncomfortable to think about how these things work. But I think it's also like, you just have to kind of like, just because you think about it doesn't mean that like, you're an evil person for using a rewards credit card. Like, it's fine. It is what it is. But like, maybe we want to think about that. And like, I'm certainly not at all perfect. Like, I don't know. I mean, like so much of this is also stuff that happens in my own life or that I'm like personally interested. I mean, to get back to the fitness fads one, like that was one where I was like, my God, like I've done so many of these things and like I will fall for it every time. I have a story on it tomorrow on like online shopping and like the countdown clock. And like the countdown clock when you shop online is made up. Like it will just reset itself most of the time, unless it's like Taylor Swift tickets, right? Uh, but like I didn't even think about that. I was just like, oh yeah, that does make sense that it's fake. But you don't think about it. And like, you know, it's tricky to operate in the economy.
It is tricky. And how did you come about wanting to write about something like this, like the big squeeze, and how maybe like giving people this information and then letting them decide, like, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and I know this is happening to me, but whatever, I'm going to do it. How did this come about?
I mean, so like this, like the column itself was born. I mean, the original idea was to call it "That's How They Get You," which I think like is pretty intuitive there
Right.
because it is something that happens in your daily life where you're like, "Oh, that's how they get you." Like it really does happen. And I
It
think it was a
does.
couple of years
Yeah.
ago. I was talking to somebody. I don't know where we were, what it was, and so that's kind of it. And like to back up a bit, like I write about business and economics, obviously at Vox, and like it is sometimes, I don't want to say hard to get people to care about economics, but a lot of people have this sense of like, oh, business and economics is so boring. Like you must be so bored at work. And it's like, no way. It's actually like it's very, very interesting. And like, hey, we all have to like live and operate in the economy. And this is like part of your daily life. And I do think a lot of this stuff is just, things we don't like, things that we take for granted that we don't think about. Like one of the my favorite stories I've done on this beat is about my internet provider. Like
Oh.
I hate my internet provider. I will not name them because I'm going to be nice to them, but I hate them. I only have one. I live in the middle of Brooklyn. You would think I would have access to more, but I only have one. And they know that I only have them. So what does that mean for me? That means that I moved into my apartment like 2.5 years ago, and they give me a nice little deal when I move in. It's whatever, $50. And then a year later, all of a sudden I look and it's $75, and the service is not better. It's a little bit worse, but it's just $25 more. And I call and I play the little game where I'm like, well, hey, I might leave. And they're like, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? Are you just not going to have the internet? Because they know, like,
They
they
know.
know they have you. And so I think that is something like people like we don't think about monopoly power, right? Like in the United States, really that much or anywhere. But that is something where like corporate power and like concentration really does impact like your day-to-day life. Like if I call Verizon, which I do not have, like once a month, being like, hey, are you guys gonna come? Because then I can threaten the other company and then I'll get a better deal. But like they just know that they like have me. And it shouldn't be that way. And I think that kind of stuff is really more intuitive for people if you can say like, hey, this is actually like a thing that's screwed up.
Yeah, the internet provider thing hits home for me too, because I've kind of had the same issue.
Really?
And then recently, like a fiber optics company came through, but the
Mm-hmm.
service was way worse. Like it's so annoying to like try to get somebody on the phone and talk to you and get
Mm-hmm.
something done. So it's like you almost just default back to what you have because you're
Right.
like, I don't even know how to get this other thing started because they won't get back to me, you know?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's really frustrating. And I think, it's obviously not the customer service person's fault. But it does feel sometimes like it's intentionally difficult. Like this is just anecdotal, but I have a friend that lives in another neighborhood here, and he has a house and was trying to change his internet from one provider to the other. And the original provider he had kind of like the customer service guy kind of threatened him a little bit and was like, hey, I know where you live. And I, it was
What?
really, yeah, it was real odd.
That's
But
strange.
yeah, but well, I mean, I don't know. That man was probably having a day.
Yeah.
But then it took him like 2 weeks to get the new thing set up. And it was like multiple visits from the new company, and they'd have to go into his neighbor's backyard. Like it is, like companies kind of know that they're sticky. And like sometimes it's something like your internet provider where they just know like you're just going to be too lazy, even if you can get another option. Or it's like, I don't know, your bank account. Like banks know that most people, once they have a bank account, aren't going to switch all of their money to a new bank, even if the other bank is offering a better deal, because it's just kind of inertia. And so
Yes.
then if you have like a checking account that maybe could be better somewhere else, you're not going to change it because you're just like most people are just a little bit, like people have a million things going on in their lives. So you're not
Yeah.
always paying attention to this stuff.
Is the squeeze sometimes that humans crave comfort? And even if you give them a better option, it may just be easier to stay with something that may not be great, but that it's comfortable for you.
I mean, there's definitely like there's a lot of, behavioral psychology that goes to it. And a lot of it really is, comfort, inertia, just kind of I'm going to stick with what I know. I mean, I do think it's fair to say also companies are very good at kind of nudging you in different ways. Like I've talked about this online shopping story that I have coming out soon where it was just like, because I know when I buy online, like I think that I know that like, hey, some of the reviews might be fake, but like, you go to book a hotel room, for example, and it tells you like, hey, there's only 5 hotel rooms left at this price. Like websites can make that up, and they do a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, and we don't think about that. And so some of it is just, like it is. I was talking to a marketing guy last week, and I said, how can people avoid these kinds of things, and avoid like tricks of shopping stuff or whatever it is, because the companies and marketers have a way of kind of tricking us on this. And he said, like you can be conscious of it for a while, but at some point you're just going to forget and you're going to get got again, because that's just like the nature of like human beings. Like if you're doing your daily life and you're trying to do your job and deal with your family and deal with your friends and deal with whatever, like you don't have time to like constantly be on the defensive
Yeah.
for like what's the little thing that's going to get you.
Do you ever look into like the ethics of these things with these stories, or do anybody that maybe are doing these things, do they ever think about the ethical aspect of the squeeze with people?
I mean, I think yes, like there are obviously like big ethical questions here. And I think it's on the part of, I mean, there are legal questions as well. Like a lot of this stuff is not necessarily always allowed, but nobody's really paying attention or looking. But I mean, we definitely live kind of, I don't know. I mean, companies have a lot of power, right? And we live in a capitalistic society where there is a profit motive. And you can have different opinions about like whether or not that's great all of the time or not. Like companies ultimately exist to, pay their shareholders. They don't exist to take care of their customers or to their workers. And that's not like I mean, there is an ethical question there, but that's just like a fact of how we run, business and society now. Um, so it is a little bit. I mean, the ethics question is always hard, and I do think it's just one where like I think my goal here is to kind of just, I mean, also I'm always looking for ideas. So if anybody has any, please let me know. But I do think it is one where it's like sometimes we just take things so for granted and we don't think about like whether or not they're good. Like this is kind of a on like one thing I wrote about not that long ago was like tech boot camps, right? And you see them everywhere, these like learn to code boot camps. And this was from a source of mine who wrote me and he was like, have you ever looked into these because they look weird? And I was like, well, I just always assumed like you learn to code and then you get a great job. But like if you take just a beat to think about it, and what they are promising you a lot of these is that you get your dream job and you're imagining like Google, whatever, in a matter of like after studying for 9 weeks. Like that fundamentally doesn't make sense. And these things are a little bit predatory because they are showing
Yeah.
up for people who maybe are looking for a career change, maybe people who aren't making a lot of money in the moment. Like they do tend to start target certain audiences, and they do sometimes also put people into a lot of debt. And so all of a sudden you wind up with, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 worth of debt with some certificate that actually Microsoft and Google don't want. Or you
Right.
wind up in these income share agreements where you get some kind of a job in tech, but maybe it's not a great one. And also, hey, you owe the company that educated you a big percentage of your paycheck. That's not to say that the boot camps don't work for everyone, but I think like that was one where I just, again, like I mean, I've seen like people I know in life on LinkedIn who are like going to design boot camps. I've been like, oh, I guess they're just going to give job and graphic design, and then not thought about, well, are they though? And like, what is the ethics of that? Promising somebody a future proof career that's not real.
There's a lot going on here. I mean, behind the
I
scenes, I look
bet.
at it as like you're pulling the curtain. You're like letting people go behind the curtain about what's happening in capitalism and in corporations. And what are your thoughts currently about the state of capitalism? And second, where do you think it's going?
Where are they going? I have no idea. I mean, and this might be a little bit more like me just because the current state of my work, like it does feel like because of like it's bad to say it, but because of inflation, because of the pandemic, because people have been honestly even during the pandemic playing with stocks and things like that, people are paying a little bit more attention to the economy, at least like in my life than in I feel like before. That's not necessarily in a good way, right? Like everybody feels really really bad about inflation right now
Right.
in a way that's like you would actually rather not have to think about that kind of stuff. um and I think that there are like it's always good for people to talk about this stuff and to think about this stuff because I think sometimes it feels like very foreign, and it feels like, well, that's just something for like very serious people somewhere else. But it's like, no, like this affects your day-to-day life. And so, it's hard, but I think it's good to talk about, like, again, like you have only one internet provider. Like, should it be that way? Like that, and that is like an extra 25, $50 a month. That, like, what if it weren't that way? And why is it like this? Or maybe your cell phone only has one provider that reaches that area, or things like that. And I think also, yeah, I mean, it's something that sometimes I feel like we're so politically divided on these things, but it's like, actually, there are some things that I think are annoying for everyone, and in the economy and in capitalism. And I have a hard time saying, like, yes, it's totally fine that only one company runs whatever. Like, monopolies are tough, are not great.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like a very interesting time. Must be for you as a journalist, writer, when you're how do you read other stories? Like obviously you're writing and
Mm-hmm.
you're doing all this research and getting all this sourcing. How do you go about reading someone else's work? And how does that impact your own work?
I mean, honestly, like, it's really nice. It's nice to see. Like, I tend to be like, I listen to like a handful of, like, daily podcasts, like economic podcasts, and that's really nice. Just hear somebody else sometimes talk through things.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of like, I get like a Politico's like morning money newsletter every morning. And it's nice to like see like what somebody else thinks is important. Like Joe Weisenthal at Bloomberg is another person who they have a newsletter that I read, or like a Matt Levine also at Bloomberg. It's nice to see somebody who approaches things in a different way, but also like to understand like how they're thinking about things. Like Matt Levine over at Bloomberg, he's like a corporate, he's a lawyer, he's very, very smart, he's a very good writer. And sometimes it's like, hey, this is too in the weeds for me, and I'm lost, I have no idea what's going on anymore. But it's nice to be like, oh, like you thought this part of this was important and I thought that part was important. And I think like he and others do a really good job of writing about this kind of stuff in a way that's like lighter and more entertaining. I mean, that being said, I also just read Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg a lot because they tend to like tell it to you pretty straight.
Yeah.
um but yeah, it is, I don't know, I mean, it's nice to like see what somebody else thinks matters, and like if they think it matters in the same way that you do.
And I always think it's interesting how you view your colleagues and how
Mm-hmm.
your work is different and the same. And like you said, how what they think is important, what you think is important as well for that. You mentioned before about um, piece you wrote and people getting angry about certain things,
Yes.
or I mean, they're writing you. Is that a common occurrence that people are writing back or providing some feedback? They're like, this really hit me in the wrong way, this article.
Not as much anymore. I used to write about politics more, and that was a little bit
Oh,
harder.
geez.
This is, I mean, this one is like, you get all sorts of feedback, and sometimes it's really helpful, it's constructive. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very personal.
Mm,
It really kind of runs the gamut.
wow.
Um, but like what I have really found in this beat is like, and it's not a bad thing, but I think people are really uncomfortable like thinking about their own sort of habits and roles. Like I said, people really didn't want to hear that like their credit card rewards were not gifts from the sky. Like I did, which is, it's like I don't know where anybody thought they were coming from,
Right.
or I did an interview with another a philosopher named Matthew Stewart, who he wrote a story about kind of the upper middle class and the way that people in the upper middle class feel like they have to compete with each other. And it's like you're on a hill and pushing everybody off, and like you want your kids to be most optimized, you need the best house, and like the sort of economic and racial implications that had. And I got a lot of yelling about that, I think in part because we had the same last name and people just did not know that I was not him to a certain extent. But I do think like we don't, like, it's easy to, and I tend to be a person who's like, companies are mean, but sometimes we also don't like to think about the ways that we are complicit in this, and not consciously, but that you do want your kids to go to the best school, you do want to live in the best house, like you do want, and we are made to feel like these things are scarce. Like a good higher education is scarce to a certain extent, right? Like not everybody gets into Harvard. So what would it look like to share more? But we don't want to.
It's so fascinating because it's a whole conversation about um, reflecting on your own behavior, personal accountability. And often when it comes back home, or if you eliminate all of the other variables and the only variable is you, it's very damning to think about yourself and how you play. It's like, have you done an article or like about climate? I'll be interested in that. Like, 'cause that's got to be very controversial, and maybe how some of our own personal habits in our homes play a part in that, but that we also talk about larger institutions and what they're supposed to be doing about that. I think there'd be an interesting personal accountability aspect to that too, I would think, on some level.
Yeah, I mean, climate is not my area. And it's tricky because I think, obviously it's good to recycle and all of that fun stuff. At the same time, like, is me putting my plastic bottle in one bin and not the other going to save the planet? No. And energy companies have done a really good job of
Yeah.
kind of putting this impetus onto customers and convincing us that it is our fault when it's like, no, 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 I think it might be you, Exxon, that's actually doing the bad.
Yeah.
So it is a little bit, yeah, it's tough on that stuff, but at the same time, like, I put the plastic bottle in the right bin, but it is hard to, like, in just your day-to-day life, sometimes like you screw up, and also like what one person considers like perfect practices is not what the other person considers. It's kind of separate, but even like, to draw an analogy with like the COVID precautions, right? Like, it feels to me like everybody's made their own personal set of rules for
Yeah.
how it's supposed to be, and then we all judge each other based on that, where it's like, well, you wear your mask on the subway and you don't, but you went to a bar and you didn't wear it, and it's like all that kind of stuff. And so I think we do have a tendency to kind of blame each other, and also kind of, I don't know, we all have our own rules. Like, I was at a friend's house a couple of weeks ago and I noticed she didn't recycle, and I was like, and then it was like, well, who knows where my recycling's going? Like, I like, is it actually happening? Like, I don't know, but I do have a separate little bin, so it's tricky.
Yeah. I mean, that's another subject. I mean, I've been recycling forever, but then sometimes you separate it and then you go and you look and see and they just throw it all in the same thing. It's
Well,
like, wait a minute, what's happening here? Like,
right,
am
right,
I
right,
am
right.
I been conditioned to do this, but I don't know actually where it goes and
Yeah.
how this is actually being recycled in the end game, or is it just a cover? I don't know. It's funny. You don't want to sound like it's like, wow, I'm going off the deep end here and
Uh-huh.
thinking about this. And I think there's an element of sometimes if people think too much about something and they start getting all of these thoughts about it, that it could become conspiratorial to others about it.
Right. I mean, it is, yeah, that kind of stuff is wild. But even like, I've poked around a little bit on a thing on like bottled water, for example, right? Which we all kind of know, like, the water coming out of your faucet is probably fine with some important exceptions. And yet, like, there's a giant bottled water industry, right? And so we're constantly recycling these bottles of water that we don't need. At the same time, the bottled water industry has given birth to the boxed water industry, which we also don't need and which isn't really environmentally better. And the canned water industry, which, like, same exact thing. It's not really that much better. And so you can see how this all sort of builds upon itself, where if you look at like a canned water that tells you, oh, no, no, but we're better than the bottled water, not necessarily. Like, it depends on what you're looking at in terms of the environmental impact. And also, like, it's still a thing you don't need. Like, just get a glass of water
Right.
from your kitchen most of the time. But we don't, and that is one where it's like, it's not like the consumer's fault, but it's because like the bottled water industry didn't really exist in the United States like 50 years ago.
Yeah. These are fascinating topics. And going back to the airport thing, I talk about the airplanes, and like I was just talking to my mom about like the baggage fees and then the all the other fees. It may say that it's low when you look
Mm-hmm.
at the less of a price for the airline ticket, but once you get into the system and
Mm-hmm.
you start paying for everything else, it's pretty much way more expensive. That squeeze felt very tangible to me, and I think that's the genius of this is like a lot of this squeeze is universally tangible for a lot of people. It's not like, well, that's not me. That doesn't happen to me. There's so
Right.
much that's happening to us. And I feel like you're highlighting this is what's happening to us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's the decision on your part going to be?
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting to like back up and figure out how that kind of stuff happened. Like
Mm.
I don't, where it's like somebody like something like airline fees. Like I am just old enough to remember that at some point, like the first check bag was free, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But I remember at the very least
Me
never
too.
having to pay for a seat, right? Like you
Of
never had to
course.
pay for a seat. And now it's like, well, what in the world is going on? Like every time you go to book, and like really what it goes back to is like at the, in the early 2000s between the, like the financial crisis and 9/11 and a big run up in oil prices, airlines needed to make money, and they were like, hey, what if we charge people for baggage? And turns out everybody's going to pay for baggage. And like some of it is that especially the budget airlines have disaggregated prices, they'll tell you, because not everybody wants baggage, not everybody wants a nice seat or whatever. But at the very least, they kind of trick you into it in the sense that they don't show you, you go to like Expedia or whatever, and you see that first price, and that first price is a lie. Like that doesn't mean anything. By the
No.
time you get through every little tiny little thing, you've been nickel and dimed for a ton of things. I mean, I've seen examples of like companies that would charge for you to like print out your boarding pass and stuff like that. And it really is, it's kind of nuts. And like what the airlines will tell you is we're giving customers more choice on what they want. And like, okay, but like say that up front. And the Biden
Yeah.
administration is working on some rules around this that would maybe make it a little bit better. Like I'm not saying that you shouldn't charge me if whatever you want to, fine, but like tell me instead of tricking
Tell
me,
me.
so
Yeah.
that like I don't think I'm clicking on a $200 seat and by the end I'm like, well, how the heck did I get to 550? What did I do? Or I'm in like the back of the plane in like some hellhole that like whatever is of my own choosing. At least.
You ever think about kind of the, maybe it's not a squeeze, but I've been followed this over the years, kind of a digital privacy or the selling of your data online, and like just again kind of thing, tell me ahead of time you're taking my data and you're selling it. I know that there's been more things about that, but that's kind of a running along the theme of like, well, you're doing things behind my back and I didn't know this was going on, but
Mhm.
like where's my piece of this cut if you're selling my data? Things like that. It's like frustrating.
Yeah, I mean the data stuff is very. I have a colleague at Vox, Sarah Morrison, who does a lot of work on this, and she's very much like a data privacy person in a
Yeah.
way that like sometimes she will get mad at me because I'm like normal people don't have time to think about this. Like, nobody is. I would love to like care more about data privacy, and at this point, I'm just like I assume that the dark web has all of my information.
That's right.
But it is frustrating to be part of the product and just to see like the different ways that you're kind of constantly giving things away. Like I've even noticed just existing as a person who's on the internet is like suddenly random websites are just asking for my email for me to like just go to the website. Like I don't even have to subscribe. And then it's like, and I'm just like, well, I guess I'll type it in because I want to look at that. And then like 2 hours later, I'm like, oh, I'm on their email list. And then
Yeah.
it goes from here to there to there. And then you obviously run into the problems of the data breaches that happen all of the time and nothing happens. And to a certain extent, like data breaches are inevitable, but it's not fun, especially when you realize that for like a Facebook, like you're the product, right? Like you
Yeah.
are being sold, or an Instagram or whatever, things like that. And you're not seeing a cut of it. And instead, just every once in a while, you get a random little notification like, whoops, your information was lost again. Surprise. Like, do you want to join this class action lawsuit? You can get some pennies. Like, it's not,
Yeah.
not great.
No, definitely not great. I actually, something like that happened to me. It was like through a mortgage that I had a long time ago with a
Oh,
different house, and there was these excessive fees. And I don't even know how this came about, but it was like a big suit and stuff like that. But it's like, again, I'm not paying attention to that.
no.
It's like, and I think there's a lot of not paying attention, especially if you make this kind of a socioeconomic conversation and all these things, if you're just trying to survive on a regular basis, why would you care? Like
Right.
to really like investigate these type of things
Right.
when you're just trying to get food on the table, be safe where you are. And I think that's kind of this predatory behavior, is knowing that there are a lot of
Mhm.
humans who just can't devote the time and energy to looking at this stuff deeply.
Right. I mean, they know you won't. Like that's why, as much as sometimes, I mean, there's a reason we have the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right?
Yeah.
After the financial crisis. And a lot of what they do and like try to do is, say that your mortgage agreement like has to be legible for a regular person. Like you can't be kind of trying to kind of get in and trick people. And companies shouldn't be doing that because, like as you said, nobody has the time to constantly be on the defensive about all this stuff, nor should they have to have
Yeah.
that kind of time or energy. That's who wants to live like that? Of like,
Yeah.
oh, gotta make sure I'm not getting screwed at every corner. Like, no.
Got to make sure I'm not getting hoodwinked every single time I do
Yeah, yeah,
something,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. Now, did you, I think, because I'm on a couple list of things I voluntarily wanted to be on. Like I
Oh,
voluntarily signed up for your the big squeeze every couple weeks, but was it you who wrote about be nice to people over the holidays? And yeah, I love that because I've seen this weird tide of people being nasty to service providers. And I was like,
yeah.
wow, Emily's so right on about this one. This is like a big hot button thing for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is like, because I have a lot of the time, or for the last few years, have done a lot of work just like talking to random workers, like so during the pandemic, like essential workers or just, about different things. And I'm always shocked how often this one comes up when I'm like, what would you like people to say? Or what would you like people to know? And people are like, I just want people to be nice to me. Like I talked to a guy here in Queens who like works at a meat store ahead of Thanksgiving in 2021, and he was like, could you just tell people to be nice? Like multiple times during our interview, because people get really upset about like their turkeys ahead of Thanksgiving. And he was like, it's going to be turkey. It's going to be fine. Don't worry. Like maybe it's not your ideal turkey, but it's fine.
Yeah.
And I think, this time of the year is obviously like stressful. Holidays are stressful, full stop, for everyone. And people often get frustrated with service workers all of the time. But like, if your flight is delayed, like the yelling at the gate worker is it like literally will not help you. It's not like that person cannot fix the delay, they cannot fix the weather. And I think especially as we head into holiday travel, like it is important to remember, and it's easy to forget. Like there's no person, anybody who tells you that they've never kind of not been nice to a service worker is lying. Like everybody has like a moment where you're like on the phone with like the internet guy and you're like, oh my God, I hate this and this sucks so much. But like that's like the moment when you have to kind of take the beat and say, like, just settle down. Like, this is all going to be fine. Like, I used to work at a translation agency, and we had a guy who worked there who used to say, well, this isn't an emergency room. And I feel like I always think about that, where it's like, oh, like, just relax. Like, these people are trying. And like, I've had plenty of customer service jobs. Like I mean, you work in an industry where you have a ton of clients and like,
Tons. Yeah.
and you're managing personalities all
All the
day, I would
time.
imagine. It sucks. And I mean, it doesn't suck, but it's tough. And it is like, it's not easy. And so I think it's just a good time of the year to kind of remember, like, everybody's a little stressed, just like settle down. And if you're 10 minutes late because the subway was slow or your food took an hour extra, whatever, like it's
Yeah.
fine. Like you're gonna be fine.
Yeah. I think it's a good perspective to have. It's is I've seen some of this, and people get really nasty to other people and stuff. I'm just like, well, let's look at the big picture of this here. I mean, you ate 15 minutes later than you wanted to. It was like, it's gonna be okay. You're gonna have to deal with it. You're not gonna die, type of thing. But
Right.
there seems, there's a heightened level of stress. I understand with people, and certainly in the last couple of years, people have spent more time with other people that maybe they wanted to or didn't want to spend more time with, and all
Mm-hmm.
these things. And as wonderful as the holiday season is, it's also a sad time of the year too. I think that's the reality, that sometimes we don't acknowledge that
Mm-hmm.
people are struggling mightily during the holidays, and
Mm-hmm.
we should have some grace about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a tough few years. And I think that's one of those where it's like and the holidays are always extra hard. And it's hard. It's easy to be like, no, I'm mad right now and like take it out
Yeah.
on someone else. But it's like, you don't know what's happening in that person's life either or what's going on for them. And I think that works on both ends. But I think I've had customer service jobs and it was wild how like a single person could just ruin my day over
Yeah.
something like so silly. And it's like, why? And I still remember it like 10 years later and I think
Right.
about it. And it's like, you don't have to be that person. And it's a tough time of the year, but it's tough for everybody. And I think it's also important to note like a lot of places are still facing worker shortages.
That's right.
And so those workers are super stretched. Like they're aware of it. It's not, maybe it used to be four people working at the whatever store with them. Now it's two of them. Um, so it's just kind of a moment to have a little bit of patience because everybody's tired, everybody's
Yeah.
stretched.
Yeah, most definitely. So as we wrap up here, what can we expect in 2023 for the big squeeze or some ideas that maybe you can talk about, you know?
Listen, if you have any ideas, I'm always open because you have to kind of keep it is tough to keep this one going
Yeah.
because I feel like my whole life now is just random people like either me like praying that I see a scam or like somebody telling me
See a
about a
scam.
scam. I'm just like, please tell me anything. But yeah, I mean, for next year, like, God, I mean, who knows what I'm going to look at. I think one of the things like, at least in the new year, I'd like to look at is like hiring practices. I am not sure how it is in your industry, but I think in a lot of industries, it feels like you're constantly being asked for like a higher and higher and higher bar and just like more evidence that you can do your job. Like, I mean, at
Yeah.
least in journalism, it's a lot of like, do you have a clip? Well, what if you send us more ideas? Well, what if you come work with us for a day? Things like that, where I can just be like, okay, guys, like how many hoops are there to jump through
Mm.
sometimes? So that's one that I want to look at, persistently interested in CVS and Walgreens locking up all of their products and what that
Interesting.
means for who and why they're doing that
Ah,
and all of that kind of stuff. So those are some of the things I'm looking at for next year. But seriously, if you or any of your listeners have thoughts, really, really open ears always because you got to come up with some stuff every 2 weeks.
well, I think that's yeah, every 2 weeks. I mean, it comes around quicker than you think, you know?
It
It's
really
like,
does.
right? And it's wonderful. For everyone who's going to be listening, Emily is an awesome writer, and I love that it lands right into your inbox and you can read it right inside the email.
Mhm.
It's awesome. It really is. I like don't subscribe to a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of stuff's just bullshit to me, honestly. But like this is awesome. Like as
Oh,
soon as I read, I think it was in my news feed, one of your articles, and
uh-huh.
then I dug deeper and I looked about this every 2 weeks. I was like, this is like my type of thing, and I voluntarily signed up for it instead of being involuntarily signed up for lists, which always happens to me. I swear. I'm like, how did I get on this Jenny's baked goods list? I didn't go to that site. Like,
No. We really
um,
should all just start our email addresses over once a year. Just otherwise, it's just impossible.
right.
It's like, well, I have no idea. But I'm glad that yeah. But no, it genuinely. But that's lovely to hear. And yes, I don't spam people. I mean, I hope not. If I do, it's not on it's on
No,
purpose.
and you're very accessible. I got your email address from the article. I was like, oh, great. I'm the type of
Mhm.
person, if I want to do something, I just reach out. And either it happens or it doesn't. The
Yeah.
person says yes or no. That's fine. Either way. And so thank you for giving me some time. And it could just let people know how they can connect with you and sign up for the Big Squeeze.
Yeah. So, well, you can find me at vox.com, VOX. That's where I work. Senior correspondent there. You can email me at emily.stewart@vox.com. And I'm on Twitter at Emily Stewart M, as in Mary, because I have a very common name.
Right. Emily, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving me some of your time today.
No, thanks for having me.